They started laughing the first day he arrived at the front. A truck coughed up a group of replacements onto the edge of the muddy position, exhausted faces, hollow eyes, uniforms hanging loose on thin shoulders. Most of them clutched their rifles the way drowning men cling to driftwood. One of them stood out immediately. Tall, a little too lean, with the thoughtful posture of an engineer rather than a frontline soldier. His rifle rested casually on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. In his other hand, he carried a kettle. Not a field canteen, not a military mess tin, a dented civilian metal kettle, the kind that used to sit on a village stove, whistling softly while someone's grandmother boiled water for tea. By the time he reached the trench, 3 soldiers were already watching him, grins spreading. "Look at that," one of them said, loud enough for everyone nearby. "Did your mother pack you a tea set for the war?" Another chimed in, pointing at the kettle. "Maybe he thinks the Germans will die laughing when they see it." Laughter rippled along the line. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't cruel either. It was the sharp, nervous laughter of men who had seen too much and grabbed onto anything that looked ridiculous just to feel something different for a moment. The newcomer stopped at the edge of the trench, adjusted the strap of his rifle, and looked around calmly, as if memorizing the faces, the layout, every detail. Then he set the kettle down beside his boots with surprising care. The platoon sergeant pushed through the small crowd. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his voice rough like gravel. "Name, rank, specialty," he barked. "Private Leonid Sokolov," the newcomer answered. His voice was steady, almost quiet. "Radio operator, field communications." The sergeant's gaze dropped to the kettle, narrowed, and stayed there for a moment. "And that?" he asked. "Your secret weapon, Sokolov?" More low laughter behind him. Leonid glanced at the kettle, then back up. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, something like that. The sergeant snorted. "You're in 2nd platoon now. We dig in at dusk. Put your equipment somewhere it doesn't get kicked into the mud. Understood?" "Understood." Leonid picked up the kettle again, holding it close to his chest, and climbed down into the trench. No one there knew that before the war, he had designed radio circuits that older officers barely understood. No one knew that he had already been at the front once before, in another unit, where a failed signal had cost men their lives. No one could guess, looking at that battered household kettle, that it was no longer meant for boiling water. To them, he was just a strange man with a useless object. They called him the teapot before the sun went down. The trench itself was nothing like the heroic paintings in newspapers. It was a long, broken wound in the ground, walls caving in, floor slick with mud and water. Rotten boards lay across the worst puddles, flexing under every step. The men inside it were hardly heroic either. Filthy uniforms, unshaven faces, movements slow and economical. They were not here to charge in glorious assaults. Most days their job was simpler and much harder. Stay alive, hold the line, endure. Leonid found an empty dugout cut into the trench wall, a dark, low shelter reinforced with timber. He dropped his pack, then, very carefully, placed the kettle on top of a wooden crate. Up close, it was uglier than it had seemed from a distance. The metal was stained, pitted, and scarred by years of use. The handle was wrapped in strips of cloth. The lid didn't quite sit flush anymore. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed details that didn't belong. A thin, insulated wire ran along the handle, hidden under the cloth. The spout's shape was slightly wrong, not quite what it should be. Along the base, nearly invisible, were tiny scratches arranged in a precise pattern. Nobody looked that closely. "Hey, Teapot!" Leonid turned. A broad-shouldered veteran stood in the dugout entrance, blocking half the light. His face was deeply lined, not with age, but with too many winters and too many battles. His name, Leonid would learn later, was Mikhail, but everyone already called him Mikhalich. "You really carried that scrap all the way up here?" Mikhalich asked, nodding at the kettle. Leonid wiped his hands on his coat. "Yes," he said. "I need it." "For what?" Another soldier pushed in behind Mikhalich, younger, with a permanent crooked grin. "You gonna serve tea to the Germans when they cross the wire?" The younger one laughed at his own joke. Mikhalich didn't. "It's part of my work," Leonid said. "I deal with radios, signals. I modify equipment." Mikhalich's eyes flicked to the thin wire on the handle. He noticed the detail, even if he didn't understand it. "You're the new radio man?" he asked. "Yes?" "Good. Maybe you can make ours talk again. The last operator cooked half the circuits trying to punch through the mud. He jerked his thumb over his shoulder. Come on, you should see what you're stuck with. Leonid took the kettle, slung his rifle, and followed him through the trench. They ducked into another shelter, darker and even more cramped. A field radio sat on a narrow table, casing scratched, knobs worn shiny by nervous hands. Cables climbed from its back into the ceiling and out into the gray sky. The air smelled faintly of burned insulation. This is our mighty voice to the outside world, Mikulich said dryly. On a good day, it whispers. On a bad day, it just dies in our arms. Leonid set the kettle on an ammunition crate beside the table. He leaned over the radio, touched the casing, then opened the back. Inside was exactly what he expected. Dirt, moisture, clumsy soldering, and several components blackened by overload. Do you have steady power? He asked. Sometimes, Mikulich replied, when the generator is in a good mood. Leonid traced one of the cables with his fingers. The design was standard, but their position, this far forward, this exposed, meant the signal would always be weak. Add enemy jamming to that, and the channel could vanish completely. He glanced at the kettle. Mikulich followed his eyes and smirked. Don't tell me that thing is part of your grand plan. In a way, yes, Leonid said. The smirk faded just a little. You rear area specialists always bring something clever, Mikulich muttered. Last one turned up with a blanket and a book of poems. The blanket got soaked. The book made nice kindling. At least your kettle might actually boil water. Leonid's expression hardened, but only for a second. I'm not from the rear, he said quietly. I've been at the front before. Different sector, different unit. Mikulich watched him, suddenly more alert. What happened there? Leonid closed the radio's back panel before answering. We lost contact, he said. At the worst possible moment, the signal was too weak. The enemy was jamming us. We couldn't reach the artillery, couldn't warn anyone. By the time the line was clear again, it didn't matter anymore. He paused. The silence in the shelter seemed to thicken. After that, he went on, I started thinking about other ways. Stronger signals, smarter circuits, equipment that can still speak when everything else goes silent. Mikulich stared at him, then at the kettle. And this? He asked. What is it really? Leonid's voice dropped a little. Not a kettle, he said. Not anymore. He lifted the lid. There was no empty space inside, no room for water. It was filled, packed with components. Coils of copper wire, improvised capacitors, hand wound inductors, carefully cut pieces of metal arranged in patterns. It was ugly, uneven, clearly handmade. But to a trained eye, it was unmistakable. It was an antenna, a signal booster. A desperate idea turned into metal. This, Leonid said, is a directional amplifier and improvised antenna. With the right tuning, it can drag a signal out of the noise, or punch one through interference that would drown a normal set. He met Mikulich's eyes. When they start jamming us, he said, and they will, this might be the only way anyone hears us call for help. Outside, distant artillery rolled across the sky like thunder. Mikulich listened, then nodded once. All right, Teapot, he said. The nickname no longer sounded like a joke. Keep your toy, but out here, if it doesn't work when it matters, nobody will care how clever it is. He stepped back out into the trench, shouting for men to check ammunition, reinforce firing positions, prepare for night. Leonid stayed alone in the shelter for a moment. He laid his hand on the kettle's rough metal, feeling every dent and scar his fingers had memorized over long nights of work. No failures this time, he whispered. No dead air. Not again. He closed the lid gently. Outside, the light was already fading. Shadows crawled along the trench walls. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy radio operators were also testing their transmitters, readying their own devices to flood the air with static and noise. Soon, the sky would be full of invisible chaos, signals, jammers, interference. And when that storm of static arrived, in this battered forward trench, there would be only one clear voice left, hidden inside an old metal kettle that everyone thought was a joke. That evening, they still laughed at him. They still pointed and smirked when he walked by with the kettle in his hand. They still whispered that he was crazy. They did not know yet that they were laughing at the only reason any of them would still be alive a few days later. By the end of the first week, The kettle was part of the landscape. It sat on crates, on mud brick shelves, on the edge of dugouts. It appeared in the corner of group photographs when someone managed to find a working camera. It stood beside Leonid during roll call, during inspections, during the rare, hurried meals. It was always there. And so was the laughter. "Teapot, don't let the enemy steal your samovar," someone called one morning as Leonid passed, carrying a spool of wire over his shoulder and the kettle in his hand. "Careful with that thing," another added. "If it breaks, our tea will surrender." The jokes changed, but the pattern never did. The men needed something to aim their nerves at, and the strange kettle was easier than the enemy, easier than their own fear. Leonid ignored it all. He walked the line, laying cable, checking connections, counting how many places the wire had been patched and repatched. He listened to the way the ground swallowed sound, how the wind dragged it away. He memorized every dip and rise in the terrain. And everywhere he needed better signal, the kettle would matter. Inside the communications dugout, time moved differently. Outside, the war was noise and motion. Inside, it was waiting. Long stretches of silence, broken by brief bursts of frantic activity when the radio crackled and someone shouted for a line, a message, a confirmation. The field radio still behaved like a stubborn animal. Some days it worked well enough. Others it seemed determined to die at the worst possible moment. Leonid spent hours hunched over it, cleaning contacts, replacing burned components with whatever scavenged parts he could find. But at night, when the trench quieted and the wind carried distant artillery like rolling thunder, he worked on the kettle. He closed the shelter door, set a small lantern on the table, and opened the lid. Copper coils glinted in the weak yellow light, hand-cut metal plates, small knobs he'd stolen off broken sets, bits of wire stripped from abandoned equipment, all of it arranged according to a plan that existed only in his head. He adjusted spacing between coils by millimeters. He scratched new marks on the inside of the lid. He carefully rewound a damaged inductor, fingers numb in the cold. Sometimes Mikulich watched from the doorway. "You really think that thing will make a difference?" he asked once. "If I didn't," Leonid replied without looking up, "I wouldn't have carried it this far." Mikulich grunted. "I've seen a lot of clever ideas die out here," he said. "The bullets don't care how smart you are." Leonid tightened a screw and finally glanced at him. "The bullets never cared whether we had a signal either," he said, "but the artillery does. Command does. If we go silent, we're alone, and alone out here means dead." Mikulich didn't argue. He just shifted his weight and leaned against the wall. "What went wrong last time?" he asked quietly. "You said you were at the front before." Leonid hesitated. His hands kept moving, but his eyes had lost focus, staring through the kettle into the past. "We had an enemy armored column on the move," he said slowly. "Our scouts found them. We had coordinates. We had everything. I was on the radio trying to get through to artillery, but the signal was weak and they were jamming us hard." He swallowed the memory. "I could hear them," he went on. "Faint, broken. They could hear us sometimes, but not clearly enough, not long enough. Every time I repeated the coordinates, half of them were swallowed by static. By the time we managed to get a clean line," he stopped. "How many?" Mikulich asked. "Too many," Leonid said. The shelter was quiet for a long moment, except for the faint ticking of the cooling radio. "That's when I started building this," he finished, tapping the kettle's metal shell. "If I could boost the signal, focus it, cut through the noise, maybe that column wouldn't have made it through. Maybe those men wouldn't have died waiting for support that never came." Mikulich exhaled slowly. "Out here," he said. "We all have ghosts like that." He paused. "Just make sure this ghost of yours actually works." He left Leonid alone with the kettle in the shadows. Days blurred into each other. The enemy shelled them on and off. Sometimes just a few ranging rounds to remind them they were being watched. Sometimes a heavy bombardment that turned parts of the trench into craters and filled dugouts with choking dust and splinters. The radio lines took the punishment badly. One afternoon, after a particularly vicious barrage, a runner burst into the communications dugout, panting, uniform torn. "Line to Company HQ is dead," he shouted. "We can't raise anyone. The captain wants to know what you can do about it." Leonid was already moving. He grabbed his toolkit, a roll of repair wire, and the kettle. The runner stared. "You bringing that too?" he asked, half incredulous, half amused. "Yes," Leonid said. "Let's go." They climbed out of the shelter and into a scene that looked like the inside of a bad dream. Sections of trench wall had collapsed into piles of wet earth. A support beam lay broken across a duckboard. Smoke drifted low, hugging the ground. Somewhere to the left, a wounded man groaned between curses. Leonid followed the cable line, running his hand along it until his fingers found the break. The wire hung loose, ends blackened where a shell fragment had cut through it. He dropped to one knee, set the kettle down beside him, and started stripping insulation from the damaged ends. "Contact down again," a voice called from a nearby firing step. "Dead," Leonid answered without looking up. "Wonderful," the soldier muttered, "just when we actually need something from HQ." Leonid twisted the fresh wire, wrapped it around the broken ends, sealed it as best he could. It was a crude repair, temporary at best, but it would hold. He looked at the kettle. This wasn't the moment for the full system. It was too exposed, too risky. But he could test one thing. He picked up the kettle, carried it to a slightly higher section of the trench wall where the earth had crumbled, and climbed just high enough to see the sky. "Hey, you trying to get yourself shot?" the runner hissed. Leonid ignored him. He set the kettle down on a jut of broken wood. The wire from the repaired line ran up beside it. He connected them with a small clamp he'd built from scrap metal. "Cover me," he said calmly. "If you hear anything incoming, shout." The runner stared at the kettle, at the makeshift connection, then at Leonid. "You can't be serious." "I am." Back in the dugout, the radio crackled to life. Static, always static. But beneath it now, faint and thin, there was something else. A voice. Distant, distorted, but there. Leonid's assistant, a quiet, nervous kid from the city, leaned over the set, eyes wide. "Is that HQ?" he asked. Leonid dropped back into the shelter seconds later, hands still dirty from the repair. "Hold the line," he said. "Don't touch the tuning." He bent over the radio, listening. The signal was weak, wobbling in and out, but it was there, just strong enough to recognize call signs, just clear enough to function. He adjusted the dials by tiny increments. The voice sharpened. "Company HQ, this is forward platoon," Leonid said into the handset. "Communication restored. Shell damage to the line. Temporary fix in place. Awaiting orders." There was a pause, a crackle. Then a reply came through, compressed and strained, but unmistakable. "Forward platoon, this is Company HQ. Good to hear a friendly voice. Thought we'd lost you. Stand by for fire mission coordinates." The kid beside him stared, then glanced toward the ceiling, as if he could see the kettle sitting up there, its metal shell humming with borrowed power. "You did that?" "With a kettle?" he whispered. "Partly," Leonid said. "It's not at full capacity yet, but it helps." He did not mention that this was only a fraction of what he intended it to do, that the real test would come not when the line was damaged, but when the enemy tried to drown them completely. By evening, the line was stable again, at least for now. Orders moved, supplies were redirected, the platoon got what it needed, barely, to keep holding the line. No one made any speeches about the kettle, no one thanked him publicly. In the trenches, men rarely celebrated what went right. They simply moved on to the next problem. But something small had changed. The jokes did not stop. Not yet. They never stopped that quickly. But the tone of them softened. "Hey, Teapot," one of the soldiers called that night as Leonid passed. "If that thing can talk to HQ, think you can ask them to send us better food?" It still drew laughter, but this time, a few of them glanced at the kettle with a different kind of curiosity. And Mikulich, watching from his usual place near the dugout entrance, said nothing at all. Instead, he lit a cigarette, took a slow drag, and looked at the darkening sky. "Storm coming," he muttered quietly. He didn't mean the weather. Out past the wire, beyond the dead trees and scorched ground, the enemy was getting ready. Reconnaissance planes had been seen more often. Individual shells had been landing in new places, testing, probing, feeling for weaknesses. Something larger was on the way. Everyone felt it. No one knew exactly when it would hit. Leonid lay awake that night on his narrow bunk, the kettle beside him on the floor. He could hear the trench breathing, distant coughs, whispers, a man talking in his sleep, the faint scrape of boots on wood. His hand dropped down, resting on the kettle's cool metal. He knew the limits of his creation. He knew what it could do on paper, what it had done in tests far behind the lines, but he also knew that the front had a way of making a liar out of every plan. Somewhere out there, enemy radio operators were testing their own systems too, their jammers, their tricks, their advantages. When that came crashing down over the battlefield, the normal radios would drown in it. His either would work or it wouldn't. In a war, that difference was measured in lives. Outside, the wind shifted. The night seemed to thicken. In the morning, shortly after dawn, the first sign appeared. A reconnaissance patrol reported enemy armor on the move. Not close yet, not visible from the trenches, but moving. The lieutenant passed the word quietly along the line. Stay sharp. Check your gear. Make sure your weapons are clean. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. If tanks were coming, artillery would decide whether they lived or died, and artillery only knew where to fire if someone could speak to it. In the communications dugout, Leonid tightened every connection, checked every cable, double-checked his improvised links to the Kettle. He tuned the sets, logged every frequency, marked the ones he suspected the enemy would try to jam first. Then, he did the only thing left to do. He waited. Outside, men joked about teapot again because that's what they did when they were afraid. They laughed too loud at nothing. They argued about pointless things. They pretended the ground wasn't trembling with the distant movement of heavy steel. Somewhere beyond the tree line, engines growled. Somewhere behind the lines, enemy radio operators began turning knobs. The air, though no one could hear it yet, was already starting to fill with invisible static. The attack began with silence. Not the calm, peaceful kind. The thick, tense silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Just before dawn, the sky over the front was a flat, colorless gray. A thin mist clung to the torn ground between the lines. The men in the trench shifted on their feet, rubbed cold from their fingers, checked their weapons without being told. They all felt it. Something was coming. Leonid stood in the doorway of the communications dugout, the radio humming dully behind him, the kettle sitting on the table inside like an ugly metal heart. He watched the horizon, searching for movement. Mikulich joined him, mug of weak coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other. "Sleep?" Mikulich asked. "Not much," Leonid said. "Good," the older man grunted. "You won't miss anything." For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then one of the sentries on the forward listening post shouted down the trench, "Engines!" The word rolled along the line, passed from mouth to mouth. Leonid strained to hear. At first, it was only a vibration, too low to be sound, a feeling in the boards under his boots. Then, slowly, it grew into a distant growl. Heavy, rhythmic, mechanical. Tanks. The lieutenant moved along the line, voice low but firm. "Positions. Everyone to your stations. Machine gunners, eyes on the approaches. Riflemen, check ammunition. No firing until they're in range." The trench stiffened, came alive. Men who had been slumping against the walls straightened. Hands stopped shaking. The lazy morning slackness vanished, burned away by adrenaline and fear. Leonid turned, stepped back into the dugout, and closed the door. Inside, the light was dim and yellow. The field radio sat in the center of the room, dials glowing faintly. The kettle was beside it, connected by a web of cables and clamps, its lid sealed tight. His assistant, the nervous young operator, hovered by the set, eyes wide. "Are we really doing this?" the kid asked, nodding at the kettle. "We don't have a choice," Leonid said. "If they come with armor, command will want constant reports. Artillery will need coordinates. The enemy will try to blind us. We are not going blind today." He checked the frequency settings again, then the improvised connections to the kettle, making sure nothing had come loose. Each cable was exactly where it needed to be. Every contact was clean. Outside, the engine noise got louder. The first shells came in low and fast. They screamed overhead, then crashed into the rear lines with a series of wet, concussive thuds. The dugout shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere nearby, someone screamed, cut off mid-cry by another explosion. The bombardment had begun. The radio picked up the artillery before it picked up any voices. A harsh, constant wash of noise flooded the speakers, static, crackles, bursts of distortion as nearby impacts shook the wires. Leonid watched the needles flutter on the meters, then stabilize. He pressed the headset against one ear and listened hard. Company HQ to forward positions, confirm readiness. The voice was faint but there, still clear enough. He grabbed the microphone. Forward platoon, standing by, he said. Enemy armor approaching, multiple engines, requesting artillery support on standby. The reply came half-buried in static, but understandable. Copy, forward platoon. Hold positions. Artillery prepared to engage on your target call. Maintain contact. Expect heavy interference. Heavy interference arrived less than a minute later. One moment, the air was just full of natural static and the electronic cough of nearby explosions. The next moment, something else dropped over the frequency like a curtain. A wave of howling man-made noise surged through the radio. It was louder, thicker, more aggressive than anything before. A deliberate wall of sound, shifting pitch, crawling across the band. The enemy jammers had switched on. Leonid flinched as the speakers screeched. The assistant clapped his hands over his ears. "What is that?" the kid shouted. "Jamming," Leonid answered, shouting back. "They're flooding our frequencies, trying to cut us off." The voice from HQ vanished mid-syllable, swallowed whole by the interference. For a second, there was only the roar, like some monstrous invisible ocean crashing against the dugout walls. Then, under it, Leonid thought he heard something. Not words, just a tone, a pattern. He leaned closer, adjusted the main tuning dial by a fraction. The noise changed, slid up and down. He chased the faintest gap in it, twisting controls with microscopic movements, searching for any place where the jammers weren't screaming. Nothing. Just more noise. The assistant's face was pale. "Can we talk to them?" he asked. "Can they still hear us?" "Not like this," Leonid said. "Not with the standard antenna." He looked at the kettle. It sat on the table, ugly and absurd, connected by its coils and wires, humming faintly with borrowed power. This was the moment it had been built for. He reached for the switch he had wired into the side of the kettle's base. It was small, almost invisible, protected by a crude metal guard to keep it from being thrown by accident. His finger hovered. He remembered the last front, the way the signal had died, the way the silence on the line had felt heavier than any explosion. Not this time. He flipped the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the hum changed. A deep, low vibration ran through the table, up his arms, into his teeth. The needles on the radio's meters jumped, then settled into a new pattern. The static in the headphones shifted, still loud, but somehow different. "Listen," Leonid said. The assistant pressed his own headset to his ear. At first, all he could hear was the roar of the jammers. Then, slowly, a narrow, strained band of sound began to poke through. "RD Platoon, this is HQ. Confirm. You copy." Barely there, warped, but there. Leonid grabbed the microphone. "Company HQ, this is Forward Platoon," he said clearly. "We read you. Heavy jamming on primary band using improvised directional antenna. Standing by for fire control." For a second, he thought the message had vanished into the void. Then, miraculously, a reply pushed its way back through the noise. "Forward Platoon, we read you. Weak but readable. Maintain this channel. Armor confirmed advancing toward your sector. Artillery batteries ready. Send coordinates when engaged." Leonid exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Outside, the bombardment intensified. Shells walked closer to the forward trenches, tearing up earth, splintering wood, shredding anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the open. The dugout shook again and again, but held. Mikulich burst in, helmet slightly askew, eyes bright and hard. "How bad?" he demanded. "They're jamming everything," Leonid said, "but we still have contact. Barely." "With that thing?" Mikulich nodded toward the kettle. "Yes." The older soldier looked at it for a second. There was no mockery in his face now. "Keep them talking," he said. "We're going to need those guns." He vanished back into the chaos outside. A few minutes later, the artillery stopped. The sudden absence of explosions was almost worse than the barrage. It left a ringing emptiness, broken only by the faint growl of engines and the distant clatter of machine guns starting to bark. The enemy had finished softening the line. Now they were coming. A runner slid into the dugout, panting, mud up to his knees. "Tanks in sight," he gasped. 3, no, 4. Maybe more behind them. Right flank, moving toward the road junction." Leonid relayed it instantly. Company HQ, forward platoon, visual on enemy armor. At least 4 tanks with infantry support, bearing east of our sector, approaching road junction. Request immediate artillery on marked coordinates. The response barely crawled through the static, like a voice trying to shout through a hurricane. Forward platoon, copy, sending, first salvo, mark impact. A few seconds passed. Then, the world behind the enemy line exploded. Leonid felt the concussions through the floor rather than heard them clearly over the jamming. But the timing was right. The guns had spoken. Forward platoon, confirm impact? HQ demanded. Leonid cupped a hand over the microphone and shouted toward the open door. Mikhalich, impacts? Mikhalich's voice came back, ragged but clear. Long, they're overshooting. Leonid turned back to the set. Rounds long, adjust 200 meters closer to our line. Repeat, 200 closer. Copy. Adjusting. Stand by. New salvo in 10. 10 seconds was a lifetime when tanks were coming. The assistant swallowed. If we lose them now, the kid began. We won't, Leonid cut him off. Watch the meters. If the jamming shifts, you tell me. The second salvo came in lower, deeper. The ground shook as if the entire world had been hit with a hammer. Mikhalich shouted again from outside. Better! One on target! They're scattering! The lieutenant's voice carried along the trench. Hold fire! Wait for them to bunch up again. Teapot, tell them to walk it left. Leonid did. Company HQ, adjust battery left. Tanks shifting to avoid craters. Need spread pattern along their path. The reply arrived ragged, barely pushing through the noise. Copy. Spread pattern. Firing for effect. The jammers screamed louder. Whoever controlled the enemy radios had noticed that someone was still talking. The wall of static surged, needles on the radio jumped, a squeal tore through Leonid's headphones. The assistant flinched. They're focusing on us, he said. They know we're here. Good, Leonid replied through gritted teeth. That means they're worried. He reached for the fine-tuning dial again, sweat slipping down his back despite the cold. Every minor twist was a guess. Every adjustment threatened to lose the fragile contact he had built. He listened. Under the manufactured howl, there was something else, a rhythm. The natural background of the band. The artificial noise was strongest at certain points, weaker at others. The Kettle's coils were fighting to concentrate their little pocket of clarity. Come on, he whispered to the machine. Hold together, just a little longer. Outside, the battle grew closer. Rifle fire snapped in sharp bursts. Machine guns rattled in angry metallic streams. Someone shouted for more ammunition. Someone else screamed for a medic. The runner burst back into the dugout, covered in dust, eyes wide. They're still coming, he yelled. One tank burning, the others pushing through. If those guns don't keep hitting them, they'll be on top of us. Leonid didn't look up from the radio. Then we don't let the guns stop, he said. He opened his logbook with one hand, scribbling quick notes, jamming intensity, signal strength, tiny changes in pitch, patterns, weak points. He had spent months thinking about how to beat this. Now he had seconds to apply it. He changed frequencies by a small offset, just enough to slide under the heaviest part of the noise, then pushed more power from the kettle into the link. The metal shell vibrated almost imperceptibly, like it was straining. The voice from HQ surged back into clarity for a brief, precious moment. Forward platoon, this is Blue Battery. We are locked on your sector. Give us the worst of it. Final fire mission before we shift guns elsewhere. Leonid's answer was calm, precise, almost detached. Blue Battery, this is forward platoon. Enemy tanks at grid reference. He read off the numbers from a mud-streaked map pinned to the wall. Infantry in close support. We are the last line before the road junction. If they break through here, they reach the rear supply routes. You must stop them. There was a short pause, filled with crackling. Then, the artillery officer's voice came back, hard and steady. Understood, forward platoon. We will keep firing as long as you keep talking. Do not lose this channel. We won't, Leonid said. The next barrage landed like the sky itself was collapsing. Even through the layers of earth and timber above the dugout, the impact was brutal. Dust rained down in thick clouds. The lantern swung wildly. The assistant grabbed the table to keep from falling, but over the thunder of guns and the screaming of metal, one thing stayed alive. The voice on the radio, thin, strained, fighting through the storm of static. The kettle's metal body was warm now under Leonid's hand. Its coils thrummed with effort, every piece working past what it had been designed to handle. Mikulich staggered back into the dugout, coughing, face streaked with black dirt. "One of them stuck in a crater," he shouted. "Tracks blown. Our boys are hammering the infantry, but we need those guns to finish the rest." Leonid nodded without looking up. "Blue Battery, this is forward platoon. One tank immobilized, others maneuvering around shell holes. Maintain pressure. Spread fire along the road. You are breaking them. Do not stop." Static roared in his ears as if trying to tear the words apart. He spoke over it. Outside, men who had mocked the Kettle a week ago now fired from behind shattered parapets, ducking as tank shells slammed into the ground mere meters away. They had no idea that the only thing keeping more steel from rolling straight over them was not courage, not luck, but a fragile link made of copper, improvisation, and sheer stubborn will. The enemy jammers pushed harder, the noise pitched higher, the signal meters jumped again. For a terrifying second, the voice from HQ was gone, completely swallowed. The assistant's face went white. "Leonid, I know." He closed his eyes for half a second, listening not with his ears but with every part of his training. Somewhere in the chaos there was always a gap, always a place the interference couldn't quite reach. He turned the dials again, slower this time, more deliberate. The Kettle vibrated, and then, like a diver suddenly breaking through the surface of the ocean, the voice was back. "Word platoon, adjust? Need confirmation. Are you still there?" Leonid almost laughed from sheer relief. "Still here," he said, still talking. All across the shattered front, the air was full of sound. Shells, engines, screams, commands. But in that cramped, dim communications dugout, there were only two sounds that mattered. The endless, furious roar of enemy static. And, cutting through it, fragile but unbroken, the connection forged by a man with a kettle everyone had thought was a joke. The battle for the road junction was far from over. The tanks were still coming. The platoon was still in danger of being overrun. But one thing was certain now. They were not alone. They were not silent. And as long as Leonid could keep that improvised teapot alive, someone with big guns and bigger reach knew exactly where to strike. The battle did not explode all at once. It crawled closer, meter by meter, like something heavy dragging itself through the mud. From the communications dugout, Leonid could not see the enemy tanks. He saw something else instead. The way the needles on the radio's meters jumped in rhythm with the distant thunder, the way the static thickened every time the engines grew louder, the way the jamming chewed at every frequency like teeth. Outside, the line was fighting for its life. Inside, he was fighting for its voice. "Forward platoon, this is Blue Battery," the artillery officer said through the roar of interference. "We are still on your grid, but we're burning through ammunition. We can't keep this up forever. What's your situation?" Leonid pressed the headset tighter against his ear. "Enemy armor still advancing," he answered. "One tank immobilized, others maneuvering around impact zones, infantry and support. Our line is holding, but barely." Mikulich burst into the dugout again, breathing hard, helmet dented, sleeve ripped open. "Teapot!" he shouted. "They're almost at the wire. One of them is trying to swing wide to the left. If it gets past that tree line, it'll hit us from the side." Leonid nodded once. "Blue Battery," he said into the microphone. "Enemy tank attempting to flank left around our trenches. We need a new concentration along the tree line at coordinates." He rattled off the numbers from the mud-stained map, voice steady even as the dugout shook around him. "Copy that," the artillery officer replied, his words warped by static. "Tree line strike, flanking armor, firing now." The kettle vibrated on the table. Its metal shell was warm to the touch now, almost hot. The coils inside hummed with a strained, uneven note, like a machine being pushed beyond safe limits. A faint smell of heated insulation drifted from under the lid. The assistant's eyes darted from the radio to the kettle. "Is that normal?" he asked. "No," Leonid said, "but neither is this battle." The next artillery salvo hit closer to the enemy. Even underground, they could feel the difference. The impacts were sharper, closer together, the concussions running through the earth like a series of punches. Dirt filtered down from the ceiling. The lantern swung wildly, casting crazy shadows on the walls. Mikulich shouted from the door. "Treason against physics out there," he yelled. "You dropped a curtain of fire right in front of them. That flanking tank's backing up. No, wait, it's stuck. You've scared it into a crater." He laughed once, short and harsh. You're actually steering them with that little pot of yours." Leonid didn't answer. His focus was narrowing, shrinking down to the crackling speaker and the glowing dials. The rest of the world was noise. This was the thread holding it together. Then the enemy changed tactics. The jamming, which had been a constant ugly blanket over their frequency, suddenly shifted. The pitch dropped, then rose sharply. The pattern became more complex, more aggressive, like someone on the other side had twisted a new set of knobs and smiled. The radio screamed. The roar of interference surged so high it became almost physical. The headset buzzed against Leonid's skull. The signal meters slammed into the red zone. For several seconds, there was nothing but blinding, howling noise. The assistant ripped his headset off, wincing. "We've lost them," he shouted. "I can't hear anything." Leonid kept his on. He forced his breathing to slow, forced his hands not to shake. Panic was useless. Fear was useless. The jamming was designed for that, to make them feel blind, small, helpless. Somewhere under the noise, Blue Battery was still out there. Guns loaded, crews waiting for instructions. They had said they would keep firing as long as he kept talking. He had no intention of going silent. He reached for the fine-tuning controls, but this time, he didn't move them immediately. He listened. The jammers were strong, but not perfect. No system was. There were always gaps, tiny ones, where power was weaker, where the pattern didn't quite overlap, where the noise flickered for just a fraction of a second. He turned the dial by a hair's breadth. The roar changed color. Another tiny adjustment, another. He shifted the kettle's output, rebalancing its coils with small tweaks he had never intended to attempt under fire. "Come on," he whispered. "Give me something, anything." A moment later, his reward came. Not a full word at first, just a fragment, half a syllable, a clipped tone fighting its way through the storm. "Ward, tune this blue." He seized it like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "Blue Battery, this is forward platoon," he said immediately, cutting into the noise. "We are still on the line. Jamming is heavier, but we can hear you. Do you read?" The response was broken, distorted, but legible enough. "Read you. Weak. Short on rounds. 2, maybe 3 full salvos left before we have to cease fire. Make them count. 2 or 3 salvos." Leonid's hand tightened on the microphone. That was all. Outside, the ground fight was reaching the trench itself. Rifle fire was no longer distant, but right above their heads. Every few seconds, a machine gun hammered, its harsh rhythm filling the gaps between explosions. Men shouted in short, clipped bursts. Words of direction, curses, cries for more ammunition, for medics, for anything. The runner staggered in again, face pale beneath the grime. "They're at the wire," he yelled. "Front tank's almost to the ditch. We're hitting it with everything, but it's still moving." He looked at the radio. "Tell them to hit it again," he pleaded. "Tell the guns to wipe it off the map." Leonid's world shrank even further. In his mind, he could see the battlefield from above, the trench like a jagged scar, the tanks grinding forward, the artillery craters, the tree line, the road. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was enough. He spoke into the microphone, voice calm, controlled. "Blue Battery, enemy lead tank has reached our defensive ditch. Infantry massed behind it, using it as a shield. We need a concentrated strike directly on the road just in front of our line. Danger close. Repeat, danger close." There was a pause. Even through the jamming, he could feel the hesitation on the other end. Artillery didn't like firing that close to friendly trenches. One error, one misread coordinate, and the shells meant to save you finished the enemy's work instead. Then, the artillery officer answered. "Forward platoon, confirm. Danger close fire mission. We'll bring rounds in as tight as we can. You must give precise corrections. No margin for error. Say again, no margin for error." Leonid swallowed. "Understood," he said. "We'll walk them in." He looked at the kettle. Its metal body was hot now, too hot for bare skin. The improvised casing rattled softly, as if something inside was expanding, straining. A faint wisp of smoke curled up from around the lid. The assistant stared. "It's going to burn out," the kid said. "If we keep pushing it, it's going to die." Leonid's answer was simple. "Then it dies doing its job," he said. "Just like the rest of us." He grabbed a rag, wrapped it around his hand, and pressed his palm down on the kettle's lid, forcing it to stay tight, to hold together a little longer. Outside, the lieutenant bellowed over the chaos. "Everyone down when the shells hit. When they land, you get up and finish whatever's still moving." Mikulich leaned into the dugout entrance. "Teapot!" he shouted. "This is it. Whatever you're doing in here, don't stop." Leonid nodded once. "Blue battery," he said into the microphone. "We are ready. Fire." The last but one full salvo of the guns answered. The shells came in like falling gods. Even underground, the force of their arrival almost threw Leonid from his stool. The dugout convulsed. A crate toppled. The lantern went out for a second, then flickered back to life. Above, the road ceased to be a road. The explosion line hit so close that chunks of dirt and stone crashed down from the ceiling. For a few terrifying moments, Leonid thought the entire shelter might collapse. He didn't let go of the kettle. "Forward platoon, report!" the artillery officer demanded through the static. "We need correction. Did we hit the mark?" Leonid pulled the headset slightly away from one ear and shouted toward the door. "Mikulich, impact report!" What came back was less a sentence and more a battle-worn yell full of disbelief. "You hit them in the teeth!" Mikulich roared. "Front tank's gone, just gone. You've carved the road open. The others are trying to turn. They're backing into each other like idiots." Leonid dragged the headset back into place. "Blue battery, this is forward platoon," he said quickly. "Direct hit on lead tank. Multiple vehicles disoriented in kill zone. We need one more salvo along the same line. Slight shift right to catch the rest before they regroup." There was a brief pause. Then, "Forward platoon, this will be our last full salvo. After this we are dry. Make it count. Confirm. Adjust right. Same range." "Confirmed," Leonid said. "Adjust right. Same range." The kettle hissed softly under his hand. He could feel it now, not just heat, but a deeper, more dangerous tension, like metal on the verge of warping. A tiny spark snapped from one of the exposed connectors, biting his wrist. He didn't let go. The assistant stared at him, almost horrified. "You're going to cook that thing alive," the kid said. Leonid's eyes never left the radio. "If it gets us one more strike," he replied, "it's worth it." Outside, the men of the platoon were crouched in shattered firing positions, helmets pressed low, heads turned slightly toward the sky. Every second stretched, every heartbeat seemed too loud. They were balanced on a knife's edge. If the guns hit true, the attack might break. If they missed, or if the line went silent. Leonid looked at the logbook lying open beside the radio, pages smeared with sweat and dirt. The numbers he had scribbled there during earlier tests and repairs blurred into a pattern he didn't read so much as feel. He made one last minute adjustment to the tuning, the smallest nudge of all. "Now," he whispered. The final salvo came. The world outside the dugout ceased to exist for a moment, replaced entirely by force and sound. The impacts were so close, they felt like someone was hitting the earth with gigantic fists. Planks snapped. Something heavy fell in the corner. A crack opened in the packed dirt wall, spilling dust. The radio shrieked with interference and echo. Then, slowly, sound from outside began to filter back in. Not tank engines, not advancing tracks. Voices, human voices, shouting, screaming, some triumphant, some in pain. Leonid grabbed the microphone. "Forward platoon to blue battery," he called. "Fire complete. Stand by for results." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned his head again. "Mikulich." For a moment, there was no answer. Then, the older soldier's voice came back, hoarse, breathless, but alive. "They're finished," he shouted. "One's burning in the ditch, one's flipped in a crater, the others are just metal scrap. Infantry's scattering. Our boys are already pushing them back from the wire." The dugout suddenly felt very small. Leonid's grip on the kettle loosened. His arm ached. His head throbbed from the constant roar in the headset. He lifted one side of the headset, just enough to hear his own voice as he spoke into the microphone. "Blue battery, this is forward platoon. Target destroyed, enemy armor neutralized, infantry broken. You stopped them." The reply from the artillery officer was quieter now, worn down by exhaustion and relief. "Forward platoon. Good copy. Glad we could be of use. We're out of shells. The rest is up to you now. Hold what you've saved." "Understood," Leonid said softly. "Thank you." He set the microphone down. For the first time since the attack had started, he let himself breathe without counting seconds. The assistant sagged back against the wall, pulling his headset off entirely. "Is it over?" the kid asked. "Not yet," Leonid said, "but the worst of it is." He finally took his hand off the kettle. The metal was almost too hot to touch. The once silent shell now ticked softly as it cooled, like something alive coming down from a sprint. A fine crack had appeared along one side of the lid. A thread of smoke still drifted up from one of the homemade connectors. He reached for it with both hands and lifted it off the table. The bottom left a faint scorch mark on the wood. The door to the dugout swung fully open. Mikulich stood there, helmet pushed back, face streaked with a mix of mud, sweat, and something close to disbelief. Behind him, the trench was still chaotic, medics moving, men shouting, rifles being checked. But the sound was different now, less frantic, less hopeless, more alive. He looked at the kettle in Leonid's hands. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, Mikulich nodded at the metal shell. "That thing of yours," he said, voice rough. "It kept those guns talking. Without it, we'd be under those tracks right now." A couple of soldiers gathered behind him, drawn by curiosity. One of them, the same crooked-grinned joker who had once asked if Leonid planned to serve tea to the Germans, stared at the battered kettle like it was some kind of relic. "I thought it was just trash," he admitted. "An old kettle, something to laugh at." He swallowed. Nobody's laughing now. Leonid set the kettle back on the crate, gently, like setting down a wounded comrade. It's not much to look at," he said, "but it did what it needed to do." Mikulich snorted softly. "Frontline's full of things that don't look like much," he replied, "until the moment they decide whether you live or die." More men crowded into the dugout, filling the space with the smell of sweat, smoke, and damp earth. Each of them glanced at the kettle. There were no jokes now, no smirks. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward and hesitated. "Hey, Leonid," he began, trying the name out for the first time instead of teapot. "When they write up the report, will they mention this?" He gestured at the kettle. Leonid almost smiled. "In the report," he said, "they'll write something like, 'Enemy armor repelled by coordinated artillery fire, thanks to timely communication from forward observers.'" He shrugged. "They won't say anything about a modified kettle, or about how close we came to losing the signal. That's not how reports work." The soldier frowned. "That's not fair." Leonid shook his head. "That's war," he said. "The important part is that you're still here to complain about it." Mikulich chuckled. "Let the paper pushers write whatever they want," he said. "We know what happened. When they ask, 'How did you hold that line with tanks on your throat?' we'll tell them the truth." He slapped the kettle lightly with the back of his hand. "We'll tell them we had one mad radio man and his stupid, ugly, miraculous kettle." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was laughter in the dugout. Not the sharp, defensive laughter from before, aimed at Leonid. Not mockery, something warmer, tired, grateful. Leonid sat down slowly on the edge of his bunk. His hands shook now, in the aftermath, when they no longer had tasks to cling to. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind exhaustion that seemed to reach into his bones. He looked at the kettle. The metal was cooling, but the marks were permanent now. Scorch lines, a crack, dark streaks where something inside had burned. It would take time to repair, time he wasn't sure he'd get. But for today, it had been enough. Outside, the battlefield slowly settled into an uneasy quiet. The enemy armor lay shattered and smoking near the road. The infantry that had survived were either retreating or surrendering. Medics moved between the wounded. Sergeants rebuilt what they could of the broken defenses. Someone in the distance began to joke again, but the edge was gone. Someone else started a tired, half-hearted song. Life, stubborn and unreasonable, pushed its way back into the trench. Mikulich leaned against the doorframe, studying Leonid. "You know," he said, "when you walked in here with that thing on the first day, I thought you were insane." "You weren't wrong," Leonid said quietly. "Maybe," Mikulich allowed. "But there's a good kind of insane, the kind that refuses to accept that the line has to go dead just because the enemy wants it to." He straightened up. "There'll be other attacks," he said. "Other battles. They'll jam us again. They'll try to blind us again. Think you can fix that contraption for the next round?" Leonid looked at the cracked lid, at the scorched connectors, at the improvised coils that had given everything they had. Yes, he said. One way or another. Mikhalich nodded once. Good, he replied, because from now on, if anyone touches that kettle without your permission, I'll personally throw them into the next shell crater. He stepped out into the trench, barking orders at the men, stitching the battered line back into something like readiness. Leonid stayed where he was for a moment longer. He reached out and rested his hand on the kettle's warm metal once more. We did it, he said under his breath, you and I. There was no answer, of course, just the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of men trying to remember how to exist in a world that, for a few terrifying hours, had nearly stopped. Later, much later, when someone from higher up came to collect reports and write neat summaries in an office far from the front, the story would be simple. Enemy attack repelled, tanks destroyed, line held. The man with the kettle would be a line at most. The kettle itself would likely not be mentioned at all. But among the men who had stood in that trench, who had heard the engines coming and watched the shells fall just meters in front of them, it would be different. They would remember how the world was nothing but noise and fear, and how, through that noise, one fragile, stubborn signal refused to die. They would remember that when every normal tool failed, their survival came down to something that looked ridiculous, until the moment it didn't. And for years afterward, when someone new joined their unit and asked why there was a battered, cracked old kettle carefully stored in the corner of the communications dugout, they would all give the same answer. Don't touch that, they'd say. It's not just a kettle. That's the reason this trench is still here. And somewhere in those words, buried under the jokes and the rough language and the half-remembered details, the truth would survive. Sometimes on the front line, the most important weapon of all is not the one that looks dangerous, but the one everyone laughed at until it saved their lives.